13 days. That's how long the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation. 13 days where one wrong move, one misinterpreted message, or one tactical error could have unleashed devastation unlike anything humanity had ever seen. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For those who lived through it, it was a time of genuine fear. When families built fallout shelters, children practiced duck and cover drills, and government officials prepared for the unthinkable. I've always found this crisis fascinating, not just because we came so close to disaster, but because somehow, against incredible odds, cooler heads prevailed. You're watching History Deciphered with Nathan Gale. Now let's get started with what might be the most dangerous 2 weeks in human history. Let's set the stage. It's 1962. The Cold War is in full swing. Kennedy is in the White House. Khrushchev leads the Soviet Union. And just 90 miles from Florida, Fidel Castro has established a communist government in Cuba after overthrowing the American-backed Batista regime. Tensions are already high following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where CIA-trained Cuban exiles attempted to overthrow Castro and failed spectacularly. The global chessboard was precarious. The US had a significant nuclear advantage, about 27,000 warheads compared to the Soviets' 3,600, and we had missiles in Turkey right on the Soviet doorstep. Meanwhile, the Soviets were feeling increasingly threatened and wanted to protect their new ally in Cuba. This combination of strategic imbalance, wounded pride, and political pressure created the perfect storm. On October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs that would change history. The images revealed Soviet missile sites under construction, medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking major American cities with nuclear warheads. When these photos landed on President Kennedy's desk, they triggered immediate alarm. The Soviets had been repeatedly denying placing offensive weapons in Cuba, and now here was proof they'd been lying. Kennedy immediately formed what became known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. This group of advisors would meet in secret for the next 13 days, debating how America should respond. And trust me, the options they considered ran the full spectrum, from diplomatic slaps on the wrist to full-scale nuclear war. Inside those ExComm meetings, fierce debates raged. Military leaders, particularly Air Force General Curtis LeMay, pushed hard for immediate airstrikes, followed by an invasion of Cuba. "We don't have any choice except direct military action," LeMay told Kennedy, even comparing any alternative to the appeasement at Munich before World War II. That's how serious the Hawks considered this situation, comparable to facing down Hitler. Meanwhile, others like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara urged caution, warning that military action could trigger Soviet retaliation elsewhere, potentially in Berlin, which was another flashpoint. Kennedy's brother Robert later remarked that if 6 of those 14 ExComm members had been president, the world might have been blown up. That's a sobering thought. After weighing all options, Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval quarantine of Cuba, which was essentially a blockade in everything but name. The United States would stop and inspect all ships heading to Cuba and prevent any more offensive weapons from reaching the island, while demanding the Soviets remove the missiles already there. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on television and revealed the crisis to the American public. His words were measured but unmistakably grave. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Let that sink in. Kennedy was openly threatening nuclear retaliation. This wasn't posturing. This was deadly serious. The quarantine went into effect on October 24th. United States forces worldwide moved to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level short of actual war. Nuclear-armed B-52 bombers took to the skies on continuous airborne alert. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. The world collectively held its breath. Would the Soviet vessels turn back, or would they challenge the blockade, potentially triggering a naval confrontation that could spiral into all-out war. Here's where things get really intense, and frankly, terrifying. What we didn't know at the time, and what wasn't fully revealed until decades later, was that the Soviets had already deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba, and local Soviet commanders had pre-delegated authority to use them if the United States invaded. Think about that. If Kennedy had followed the advice of his military leaders and launched an invasion, Soviet commanders on the ground could have responded with nuclear weapons without waiting for orders from Moscow. The dominoes would have started falling, and there would have been no way to stop them. While all this public drama was unfolding, with both sides talking tough for their respective audiences, something crucial was happening behind the scenes. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, met secretly with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. In these back-channel conversations, Robert Kennedy offered a compromise. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba and would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviets removing their missiles from Cuba. Critically, the part about the Turkish missiles would remain secret, allowing both sides to save face. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a long, emotional letter to Kennedy suggesting a resolution, but before Kennedy could respond, a second, more hardline message arrived from Moscow. Kennedy made a strategic decision to respond to the first letter while ignoring the second. And finally, on October 28th, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow that he had ordered the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. But what caused this dangerous situation in the first place? Several factors converged. First, there was the strategic imbalance I mentioned earlier. The Soviets felt vulnerable with American missiles so close to their borders in Turkey, while few Soviet weapons could reach the United States. Khrushchev saw placing missiles in Cuba as a way to quickly level the playing field. Then there was the Cuban context. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro was convinced the Americans would try again. As he later said, accepting Soviet missiles was our means of defending our sovereignty. From Castro's perspective, Soviet weapons were an insurance policy against American intervention. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev also faced intense domestic political pressures. Kennedy had appeared soft on communism after the Bay of Pigs failure and couldn't afford another perceived weakness. Khrushchev was being criticized by both Chinese communists and Soviet hardliners for being too accommodating to the West. Both men felt they needed to project strength, which is always a dangerous combination in international politics. The resolution of the crisis had immediate and lasting effects. Beyond the removal of missiles from Cuba and Turkey, both sides recognized the dangerous potential for miscommunication during nuclear standoffs. As a direct result, the Washington-Moscow hotline was established in 1963, providing direct communication between leaders during future crises. Imagine how different the outcome might have been if Kennedy and Khrushchev could have picked up a phone and spoken directly. The shared recognition of nuclear dangers also contributed to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in August 1963, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. This was the first step toward more comprehensive arms control that would develop in later decades. Politically, the crisis had divergent effects on the two leaders. For Kennedy, the resolution boosted his domestic approval and international standing. He was seen as having stood firm while finding a peaceful solution. For Khrushchev, though, the perception within Soviet leadership circles was different. Many viewed the withdrawal of missiles as humiliating, and this contributed to his eventual removal from power in 1964. More fundamentally, the crisis altered how we think about nuclear weapons. The concept of mutual assured destruction, aptly abbreviated as MAD, gained prominence. Both sides recognized that nuclear war was unwinnable. As Soviet Marshal Andrei Grechko later noted, "The missile crisis taught us that nuclear weapons are political instruments, not usable military weapons." This recognition would shape deterrence theory for decades to come. Let's look at the crisis from different perspectives. For Americans, the crisis is often portrayed as a triumph of Kennedy's steady leadership and strategic thinking. The standard narrative emphasizes Soviet capitulation and American resolve. But as historian Sheldon Stern later argued, the standard narrative of US triumph masks the reality that resolution came through mutual compromise, not unilateral Soviet capitulation. The fact that the US quietly removed missiles from Turkey as part of the deal remained classified for decades. From the Soviet perspective, Khrushchev initially tried to portray the outcome as a victory, emphasizing America's non-invasion pledge regarding Cuba, but his colleagues increasingly viewed the withdrawal as humiliating. Soviet military leaders saw the crisis as evidence of strategic inferiority and used it to argue for building up their nuclear forces, leading to greater parity in later decades. For Cubans, the crisis revealed their vulnerability as a pawn in superpower politics. Castro was notably excluded from direct negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev. He was outraged at not being consulted before the Soviet decision to withdraw the missiles. What's particularly striking is that declassified documents later revealed Castro had actually advocated for a nuclear first strike if the United States invaded Cuba, a position so extreme it alarmed even Khrushchev. The international community watched in horror, believing they might be dragged into a war not of their making. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to both Kennedy and Khrushchev, urging restraint, reflecting widespread fear that smaller nations would suffer most in any nuclear exchange. One thing that continues to fascinate me about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how many moments there were where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong. There was the incident with the United States U-2 spy plane that accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace during the crisis, at a time when nerves were already at breaking point. One thing that continues to fascinate me about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how many moments there were where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong. There was the incident with a US U-2 spy plane that accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace during the crisis, at a time when nerves were already at breaking point. There was the Soviet submarine B-59, surrounded by US Navy ships dropping practice depth charges, whose captain wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo, but was talked down by his second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, a man who literally saved the world. These near misses highlight something former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reflected on decades later. We came within a hairbreadth of nuclear war without realizing it. It's not that we made the wrong decisions, we just didn't know how close we were to the edge. The crisis revealed how miscalculation, incomplete information, and escalating tensions can create a dangerous momentum toward conflict that becomes difficult to stop. So what can we learn from those 13 days in October 1962? First, the importance of diplomacy and back-channel communications during crises. The public posturing between Kennedy and Khrushchev might have led to disaster if not for the private negotiations happening simultaneously. Second, the value of empathy in international relations. Kennedy's ability to understand Khrushchev's political position and offer him a face-saving way out was crucial to peaceful resolution. And third, the recognition that in nuclear confrontations, there are no real winners, only degrees of loss. The Cuban Missile Crisis represents a pivotal moment when human civilization faced the real possibility of nuclear annihilation, yet stepped back from the precipice. The lessons derived from these 13 days continue to inform international relations and crisis management today. In an era of renewed, great power competition, with nuclear arsenals still capable of destroying civilization many times over, these lessons remain vitally important. Sometimes, history's most important moments are the disasters that didn't happen. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as perhaps the most important non-event of the 20th century. The nuclear war that could have ended everything, but somehow didn't. And for that, we can all be profoundly grateful.